Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library. My name is Amy Perry, and I'm the Adult Services Specialist here at the library. Thank you for joining our program, Interpreting Slavery at Museums and Historic Sites. Now, let me introduce our presenter. Dr. Jody Skipper is an Associate Professor of Anthropology and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Skipper has been involved with historical archaeology since the late 1990s and has a special interest in African diaspora. For over a decade, Dr. Skipper has been working with Behind the Big House program to help interpret slavery in local communities. She is the author of Behind the Big House, Reconciling Slavery, Race, and Heritage in the U.S. South. Dr. Skipper will be in conversation with Ron Gauthier. Ron is the Youth Services and Community Partnerships Manager for the Gwinnett County Public Library System. Please welcome Ron and Dr. Skipper.
Good evening, everyone. It's a delight to be here and to have an outstanding author and a fascinating book. This is my favorite book of the year. So, Dr. Skipper, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to dig right in. I'll ask, can you tell us about the project that led to the book and some of the people who were involved in developing that project?
Absolutely. So the project is called Behind the Big House, and it's co-founded by two private homeowners who live in Holly Springs, which is in the North Mississippi Hill Country. So if anyone who's watching is familiar with Oxford, Mississippi or Memphis, Tennessee, it's generally midway between those two cities. And Chilius Carter and Jennifer Eggleston are the two homeowners who about 11 years ago were living in Holly Springs, and they were living in this historic Antebellum home that was built by 1851. And what they noticed was that there was a dependent structure right near the main house that they were living in. So it's not what you would consider a plantation site, but an in-town estate. So it's a relatively small amount of property, but you have this big estate house and then these dependent properties right adjacent or to or near them. And in their particular case, after doing some historical research, they realized that that particular structure was probably built sometimes in the 1840s and had housed enslaved people on that property. So that number of enslaved people generally included about 9 people, the majority children. We know that from slave census schedule records, who would have serviced the people who lived in the main house for years, as you would see in a comparable way at a rural site, but just in this urban slavery context. And they wanted to really think about what this particular site on their property meant, especially against this backdrop of a long-time historic antebellum pilgrimage in the city of Holly Springs that had taken place since the 1930s and had focused mainly on majority white plantation owning families and their interior furnishings and the architectural structures, but not saying much about the enslaved community that helped to sustain the lives that they led all of these years. So Chilius and Jennifer started to talk to several other homeowners in Holly Springs who had similar slave dwelling sites on their private properties to try to think of a way to bring attention to the experiences of enslaved people who were the majority population in Holly Springs at that time. And in 2011, Jennifer Eggleston contacted a friend of hers, Joe McGill Jr., who at that time had started what he was calling a slave cabin project. He was working for the National Trust, and at the time he was going around the Southeast US, and he would see all of these slave dwelling sites that were either in ruins due to neglect or because people had no idea what they were, so they weren't being preserved. And he was trying to bring attention to those properties by sleeping in them overnight. So Jennifer and Chilius contacted him and asked him if he knew of any community-wide programs that could help interpret slavery. And at the time, there were none. So he helped them to get this program off the ground. And by 2012, they had this slave dwelling interpretation program called Behind the Big House.
Wow, that's awesome. I think when I was in Louisiana many years ago, I did take a tour of some antebellum mansions, those that were along the River Road area from like New Orleans to Baton Rouge, some in St. James and St. Charles Parish. And I do remember, and maybe this changed, over the years, during those tours, there was never any mention of the slave quarters, the slave community. So would you say your project is maybe reaching out into the communities throughout the country to actually better tell that slave story? Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I think that's, there are a few sites in the country. If we think about, especially those sites related to our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, those particular home sites have had more historical pressure to interpret slavery. And that's still relatively recent. So if we think about even National Park Service sites, most of those really started to have these public narratives of slavery come about in the 1990s, which is not that long ago. When we think about these places like River Road, for example, it's even more recent, and it's not the majority of the houses either. So you have places like Laura Plantation that do interpret slavery to a certain extent, but it's not the majority story. The only site in that particular area that interprets the lives of enslaved people as the majority story is the Whitney Plantation in Wallace, Louisiana, which is only a few years old. So this whole phenomenon is just a relatively recent one. And what we wanted to do in our case is tell a more complete, holistic story. That's how Chilius and Jennifer would describe that. And we wanted to do it not because there was public pressure to do it, but because it's the right thing to do, because this is a history that we all share as Americans. And I think that they felt like we have a responsibility to do that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on that same line, when I think about that, I did another tour in New Orleans, and this was a tour of the city. Some of the historical landmarks, what was missing from that particular presentation and during the tour was slave areas, slave pens, auction blocks, so on and so forth. And as you know, New Orleans had many of those. There was the great St. Charles Hotel with the beautiful rotunda where slaves were sold. And then some were just sold on the streets, on docks, and private pens that were owned. So there wasn't much information about that, as I remember from the tour. What do you think is happening to, in that case, get those stories told as well?
There's some people in New Orleans, certainly, who are working on these things and have been for years. I think what happens in places like New Orleans, even to some extent, places like Charleston, is that I think most Americans think, when they think about slavery, they think about slavery as something rural. So they think about these big plantation houses out in the country where you have these wooden ramshackle slave cabins. They don't think about how pervasive slavery was in most of the landscape of the US South, even within cities like New Orleans. So that even if people are walking around, walking around what's called the French quarters, they might literally be looking at slave dwelling structures or former sites of slavery and not even know that. So if those sites aren't marked, or if there isn't particular attention brought to these places, people just don't know. And we have a similar case in Holly Springs where you have these, as I said, big houses with one structure next to it. And if you don't identify those as slave dwellings, it becomes hidden in plain sight. And I think that slavery is very much hidden in plain sight in the city of New Orleans in those structures because we tend to not recognize them that way.
Awesome. So you did some research on why people do race work. What makes individuals want to do this type of work? What did you learn from your experiences?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So one thing that happened after we started the Behind the Big House program is that one of the homeowners at the time, David Person, who's a white male, Texas native, but with roots in Holly Springs, got together with Dr. Alicia Williams McLeod, who was then chair of humanities at Russ College, which is a historically Black college in Holly Springs. And she and her students had visited the first Behind the Big House project, and David's house was one of those antebellum houses on tour. And it was one of the first times in which an integrated Holly Springs population of Black and white folks got together and were actually talking candidly about slavery. And they wanted to think about how to continue to do that. How do we sustain that beyond this tourism program that we have once a year? So they started this group called Gracing the Table, a racial reconciliation, racial healing group that helps us to think about the contemporary impacts of slavery in the present. So although slavery might have legally ended at a particular point in US history, we still live with its impacts. And they felt that if we don't think about that, then the work of interpreting slavery is incomplete work. So this year that I started working with Behind the Big House was 2013. That was also the same year I became involved with people like David who worked with Gracing the Table. And we started to think about how to structure discussions around racial healing. We would do that through discussion groups. We would do that through tours. We would do that through films. And I worked with them for about 8 years before I really started to think through what about us? What about us as a group of people had come to this point in our lives where we felt like it was important to do this kind of work. So in 2019, I started to interview those people, David, Alicia, two others, Wayne and Ricketty Jones, who worked with our group closely as well and still do, to ask them, brought them to a point in their lives that they felt like racial reconciliation work was significant enough to pursue, not because it was required by a job through DEI work, but because something about their lives felt like we would have a better future as Americans for doing that. And it was interesting for me because as I said before, I worked with them for several years, but came to understand more about their childhood socialization, the people in their lives who influenced them in a way that would cause them to really think about history, like not as just white history because they're white or Black history because they're Black, but shared history. And that's the thing that I found that we all had in common. We had to be able to all respect the experiences of our ancestors in order to be able to respect the experiences of contemporary people. And I think that's something that the US education system and more broadly, maybe the US tourism system doesn't do a good job of doing. So I really wanted to try to think through that process in these other people.
I like the term shared history. I want to use that if I could borrow it at some time. So there are a large number of books about slavery, nonfiction and fiction, very popular. My guests check them out all the time. I remember when Jubilee was published in 1966. That's almost 47 years ago. And one of my best books ever, read it 3 times. So what is the impact of slavery in the present? Why does it matter?
It matters because so many of the structures put in place before the 1860s and up until the Civil War were reinforced after the Civil War. So, sometimes I'll have, and even when I'm teaching classes, I will have students ask, why are we still talking about the impacts of slavery if the Civil War ended in 1865? And we talk about it because even after 1865, the US federal government as a whole still failed to grant African Americans full civil rights. Those voting rights that we consider full civil rights weren't even granted until 1965, 100 years later. So that means that my parents' generation is the first generation with full legal rights in this country. That's how long of a pull this institution of slavery has into the present. It doesn't mean that the US couldn't have done better. We had the opportunity during Reconstruction, especially when you had Black people more fully participating in the political process as voters. But then Southern states by the year 1890 or the early 1890s had pulled back on most of those privileges that Black people didn't get again until the 1960s. So I think it's important to understand just how much of a long stretch that this is, that yes, slavery might have legally ended, but the structure that it's set up continues to be with us in so many ways.
Absolutely. And the interest is definitely there in studying about that era. I noticed recently that there are a large number of movies about the slave era. There have always been. I mean, we could go all the way back to the miniseries Roots in 1976, which was groundbreaking in itself. But there are a large number of movies. I saw a comment somewhere that said, oh, no, not another slave movie. Yet those quote unquote slave movies proliferate and they're doing well. So do you see this trend continuing?
I do. I think that one of the things that I enjoy teaching the most is slavery on film. So I use film like Roots. I use the 1970s version and I use the 2016 version so that, my students could think about how things might have changed in terms of how we represent slavery. The reality is, I understand to some extent why people feel like they're being flooded with these images through films. But it's really not the case because this is still relatively recent that we've been able to think about slavery in very complicated ways through even TV series like Underground, for example, which was very, very popular. I do think that it's something that's going to continue. I think for folks in Hollywood, even if you take Will Smith's Emancipation, for example, he admits that he had to get to a particular level in Hollywood to even be comfortable engaging something like this. And I also think that the contemporary political movement, this intersection with the movement for Black lives and other things have really allowed people to think more about why, as I said before, slavery still seems to be so significant. And my guess is that this is going to continue to happen as long as we have racism. We're going to have to really think through the root of it, and that's slavery, of course. And films are accessible to people, right? Not everybody might read a book, but they could find a film pretty accessible.
And you have an interest in all of those formats, cinema, literature, so on and so forth. So I agree, we will probably be around for a while. Okay, excellent. So tell us about what was the writing process like for this book? Because you did a lot of research, it's very involved, and again, an extraordinary read.
Thank you. The writing process was really slow at first. I have to say that. One of the reasons that I think that it started off slowly for me is because I had to convince myself that I had the ability to represent other people's experiences. So I wrote this book as something that I called autoethnography. It's part ethnography because I'm an anthropologist. So it's thinking through slavery, representing slavery through tourism. I'm looking at that phenomenon. At the same time, I'm thinking about how race has impacted my life and the work that I do. But because I work so closely with other people, I also had to be fair and think about how race impacted their lives through these interviews that I talked about. And it's a big responsibility to represent other people. So even to begin to write this book, I had to feel comfortable enough with my relationships with them to represent their experiences in a critical way, but also in what I consider a fair way. So when I convinced myself that I was able to do that after about 8 years. I actually started doing the interviews then in 2019. That helped me to structure this book. But I really started writing a lot because COVID started and I had some flexibility to do that. The Behind the Big House program takes a lot of time and energy itself. It's an all volunteer effort. So one of the reasons that I was able to write quite a bit is because COVID postponed our program for a while. So I didn't necessarily have the level of commitments and responsibilities that I would have normally have. So I just really sat and thought through a lot of these things. And I have to say that it was emotional for so many reasons. One, mainly because one of my main friends and collaborators, David Person, who's featured in the book, passed away in early January of 2021. After he died, I wasn't quite sure what to do. I thought about stopping the book project at the time, but then I felt that if I did that, then we would no longer have the archive. We could have this great program for a finite amount of time, and maybe people would forget or not know. So I felt a responsibility to continue to do that. I was also writing when the movement for Black Lives became so political. So I can't say that it was easy to watch a lot of what was going on TV and write about such sensitive issues at the same time. And that really took an emotional toll in lots of ways. At the same time, watching young folks march in the streets, marching around equity, marching around shared history and interest was also inspiring. So it was a bit of a roller coaster ride.
Wow. So what was an early experience where you learned that language really had power?
That's that's a lot to think about. That's a good question. I mean, it was probably subconscious for so many reasons. I grew up in southern Louisiana, where I grew up with a grandmother who was actually a first generation English speaker. And people might not think about that for someone with a relatively long ancestry in the United States. But my parents grew up, at least my mom grew up in an urban city in southern Louisiana. So she understood what we considered was a broken English or French Creole. My father spoke it more fluently, and both of my grandparents certainly did. So I valued that because at a particular point in life, I knew that was unique and different. But I also knew that when my grandmother was younger, the state of the Louisiana stopped valuing that as stopped thinking about the language that they spoke as valuable. These Black Creole folks were being socialized and assimilated into speaking English because speaking English or speaking what was considered standard English gave you a certain sense of mobility. You could move around class-wise in that sense. Otherwise, you were just kind of backwards in country speaking this Creole. And when I was younger, what happened, and this is something that I talk about in the book, is that you got this Cajun cultural renaissance that really kicked in the 1970s when I was born. So you had Cajun folks in southern Louisiana start to reclaim the power of their language, Cajun French, food, music, all kinds of other things. At the same time they did that, they left Black folks out of that movement. So I grew up at a moment when you had these Black Creole people reclaiming the power of Creole heritage largely through language. And there was a Creole magazine. I remember the Cravens brothers from St. Landry Parish was so integral in advocating for that. We had Creole institutions. I had a cousin, Geneva, who I named one of the chapters after, who was a standard French teacher, Parisian French per se, but also who spoke Creole and was very integral in that Creole Renaissance as well. So I have to say the power of language for me really started then, although I probably didn't realize that until I was able to reflect on that.
Wow. So your book is vigorously researched. So we thank you so much for writing it. What kind of research do you do, and how long do you spend researching before beginning to actually write the book?
Yes, so I'm an archaeologist by trade, actually. So my research is mostly in material culture, more specifically African American material culture. So I think about what kind of things my African American ancestors, our African American ancestors left behind. And a lot of that we find underground. We find pottery, we find jewelry, we find game pieces, all kinds of things that could help us piece some of their lives together. But the slave dwellings are also material culture. So I try to study how Black people inhabited those spaces. They were often restricted to certain rooms in those dwellings, restricted in how they could move from the slave dwelling to the bigger main house. All of those things I try to really get us to think about. So trained in archaeology, trained in African American studies to think about that, but also as an anthropologist trained in doing something called ethnography and also participant observation. So what that means is that to understand how a community works and thinks about itself, I have to insert myself in the community. And in this case, I started out just volunteering with Behind the Big House, so it wasn't intentional, but as a trained anthropologist, I can't help but observe. So that means that I'm working with people, observing this phenomenon of slavery representations as a form of tourism in the state of Mississippi. So that process for me just has been ongoing. It's not something that necessarily has a particular starting point or a stopping point. I just had to tell myself that this was the time to write a book. After, again, I had done this for 8 years, but for some anthropologists, this could go on for decades and decades. In some cases, a project that you look at for 6 months. So it just really depends on the person who's doing the research. And when I did my dissertation, that was probably 2 or 3 years, so relatively short a period of time. It really just depends.
So if you could ask a question to any historical figure, who would you want to learn from? What would you ask and what would you want to learn?
That's a great question. I would probably ask Zora Neale Hurston about how much of her autobiography is actually true. I think I would go with that. I mean, I think was genius in so many ways. We still see that impact even on a movie like Descended, where she did so much of the research with a particular former enslaved person in Alabama. But what we don't know that much is about Zora Neale Hurston from her personal perspective, right? There's so much about her life that she had to keep closed for all kinds of reasons. And I would probably want more details about that. So especially as an anthropologist.
Are there any good biographies written about Zora Neale Hurston that you think get close to probably who she really was? Or
that's a hard question. I mean, the Alice Walker, the author, is so well known. She actually is responsible for getting us to think about Zora Neale Hurston's life as a writer, I think more than most people. So she started some of that early writing about her in that way. I think that there's some people who've really done some interesting work in terms of getting us to think about her initially as a writer, but then as an anthropologist. Because we don't have so much of her perspective about herself, I think maybe that's a harder thing to kind of engage. But there are some great films, certainly, and one that recently came out as, I think it was part of PBS's American Experience, which features a couple of anthropologists who have done some of this research. So I don't remember the subtitle, but for those who are interested, who haven't seen it, I do think it's worth a watch.
I did read much of her work. Do you think that maybe any of her novels or fiction was somewhat semi-autobiographical?
Yeah, well, Dust Tracks on a Road is certainly semi-autobiographical, but I do think that, the folks who study her you can kind of read through the fact that she's not necessarily being fully candid with this information. You're talking about a Black woman who's practicing anthropology in the early 20th century, which is almost unheard of. There are only a few people at that time doing that. She has these white patrons who are funding her research, which means that she also has to do that research through the lens of what they want to see, while trying to protect her intellectual property at the same time. It's a balancing act that I think is just hard for most of us to fathom someone having to do, wanting to be able to represent Black people as themselves in the early 20th century is a very tricky thing for anyone to be able to do. It's tricky now to be able to do that. It's such a huge responsibility.
Sorry, she didn't get what I think was her total credit and recognition for her contributions in the Harlem Renaissance.
She hasn't, but she's getting more now, so that's hopeful.
So you wrote once, programs such as this take a small group of willing participants who believe that those who may not have received equitable treatment in the past deserve it in the present. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yes, I can. I think that relates to some of what I said earlier about the folks that I interviewed and coming to understand that they really have this open, broad understanding about a shared history. What I'm specifically saying there is that we know that African Americans have struggled with equity in the US since they've landed here. So we're talking about centuries. We know that there's still a struggle to represent African American history, to make it a priority in this country. So I think that in order for us to think about what it means for African Americans, sort of equity now, we really have to understand what's happened historically, why this hasn't happened up until now, what historical barriers there might have been. So I think that the people with whom I work really feel like somehow if we understood more about history, we could probably think about African Americans as more fully deserving of equality in the present. I think that it's pretty convenient for folks to say something is in the past, or we don't need to revisit that. We don't need to understand that. But if we don't understand why African Americans, in spite of their survival, and it's actually a miracle that we have survived in so many ways, still struggle here. Even with the opportunities that we're supposed to have, there's still so many barriers.
Well, it's great because your book is out at a great time, and we're focusing on all of the lives of slaves that have not been told. And so I think of some of the recent work that's out about some of the racial expulsions that occurred throughout the country, from Rosewood to Wall Street in Oklahoma, even in Georgia here with the Oscarville, Georgia town was part of a racial expulsion in 1912. So, and we're beginning to see more of that emerge. What do you think has brought out this interest finally in getting these stories done?
Yeah, I think, again, the movement for Black lives has certainly helped. I think that movement and others associated with it are really making that connection that I just talked about, that in order to understand why people are marching in the streets, why people are thinking about these issues across institutions, it's because those issues are innately tied to these things that have happened. In many ways, this country has strategically had a sort of amnesia where Black history is concerned. So the fact that you could have things like Rosewood have such devastating impacts on particular communities, so much that the entire community moves and then essentially dies. It's amazing to think about the fact that something like that could happen in the US and then not be known publicly for so many years. In the case of Rosewoods, it took up until the 1990s for a formal report to come out. So that's how relatively recent. And then we had a Hollywood film that started to connect people. But you're talking about decades and decades of folks strategically forgetting about the fact that these things have happened. So now we're in a period of recovery. There's a lot of backlash to it, obviously, but I am hopeful that this is a period of recovery.
Seems like that's happening. I mean, the story of Oscarville, Georgia, the city that's mainly under Lake Lanier, just until recently, over the last 8 years, there was a discovery of an interest in writing about that story. So there was a book, and that book led to some interest. But I was amazed at the number of people in Georgia who I met was not even aware that there was such an occurrence. So I'm just happy that these stories are being written and these stories are being told.
And I just learned about that today from you. So it's I'm learning something new all the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. So glad the work is going. So in conjunction with your book, you also published over the years several peer-reviewed journal articles. That's really heavy academic stuff. What can we expect next from an author with all of your talent?
Yes, so I'm really thinking about now how to help local communities who might be interested in doing this type of thing, might be interested in interpreting slavery at a local level, but they don't have a lot of economic resources or a lot of human resources to be able to do that. As I said before, our program is all volunteer, unlike others where people might be more fully staffed or either paid in many respects. So I understand that the majority of these sites are going to be privately owned with people who need a lot of support. So as part of that process, I created a website called behindthebighouse.org that breaks down these steps for people who might be interested in doing this kind of thing. And I also started doing a few workshops with different institutions also interested in understanding how they might be able to do this type of thing. And I've done some of this work with one of my archaeology colleagues, Dr. Jody Barnett, Behind the Big House in the state of Arkansas. So that's important to also say. It's not just in Mississippi, it's in the state of Arkansas as well through Preserve Arkansas. So I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about how to get people to think through that. Also, how to get people to think about what it means to do this work with a full-time job as an academic. It requires a lot of thought, a lot of balance. And I'm also thinking about how to also look into some of these issues in my, my home or ancestral communities of Lafayette Parish and also St. Martin Parish in Louisiana. So I'm in the early stages of working with a couple of colleagues there who are thinking about some of these issues as well. So hopefully that research will be made public soon.
That's awesome. We're looking forward to that. So I've read many, as I said, many nonfiction books about slavery, and the authors do incredible work and just bringing this to the surface. I was wondering, have you ever considered crossing over and maybe doing fiction about this era? Because I find some of the fiction titles out there absolutely fascinating.
Oh, I absolutely have thought about it. Do I feel like I have the skill set to do that now? No. I mean, it really takes some skill to be able to understand the historical context and then make it accessible in that way. And I'm enamored by people who write historical fiction. I would love to maybe someday. My favorite books is Cane River, which is largely based on one woman's genealogy in thinking about this area of Natchitoches, Louisiana, and where Melrose Plantation is. But the author does a stellar job of making that story accessible, filling in the pieces, trying to imagine what her ancestors were thinking. And because we don't have the writings from many enslaved people, and with the writings we do have, a lot of them were still restricted in what they could say. So you have to imagine a lot of that. You have to speculate, and historical fiction lets us do that. I just wish I had the skill set. I'm going to have to work on that.
Well, I enjoyed Miss Chatterme's book as well. And she also did one entitled Red River. And that one was absolutely extraordinary, historical fiction.
Absolutely.
And it was so easy to transport me into 1870s Louisiana. It was so extraordinarily realistic. So
it's my favorite book.
So, and where can our viewers get a copy of your book?
So you can get it through most online sources, Barnes and Noble, Amazon.com, those types. For those who might want to support a local bookstore, our local Oxford Square books, you can order it from them online. That's an alternative. I know some people prefer to do that, and they can have it shipped to you. They even gift wrap. So if you're sending it to someone as a gift, that's an option. But if you Google it, you'll see most of the major online book houses you could get it through. But I just want to give you this alternative for a smaller local bookstore that could also get it to you just as efficiently.
Fantastic. What do you recommend for families to do when visiting historic sites?
Question. I think, it varies. When I really started to study tourism, I was dependent on trying to do as much research in advance about a site and then going to the site and then kind of seeing how much that might match up with what I've read. But because I'm also interested in how people tell stories at the sites, I've also like to be surprised. So now I don't do any research. I just go to be surprised. But I think that it probably depends on what kind of work you're trying to do. And the participant asked specifically about family. So especially if you have young children or teens, I think it probably does, especially if you're going to a site of slavery, to look at as much context, broad context, age-appropriate context on slavery before they go there, so that they're in the position to fully participate and ask questions. There are often guides who want you to ask questions. Sometimes they might not have the answer, but might be able to point you to it. And I have to say, when I've been on tours, one tour on that I went to at Laura Plantation on River Road, most of the poignant questions came from teenagers. They knew about the Black codes in Louisiana. They knew about so many things that they'd obviously gotten from home or from the school system. So they were so informed, and their education made for a richer experience for everybody there. So I would say, do some background research, sit with the family, discussions, maybe even read a historical fiction novel, something that's accessible. There's so many accessible children's books on slavery now, a quick Google will do that before you go to the site so that you're prepared to engage with it.
Awesome. I wonder if she could talk more about the challenges of dealing with organizations who feel the need to put on a nostalgic view of the South, especially if they feel that otherwise they will lose financial backing.
Yeah, another great question. I mean, this is something that I've certainly struggled with in my work. I think that what happens is that a lot of these sites become so dependent on a tourist audience that's not accustomed to hearing complicated histories, not just not hearing about Black people, not hearing about the complicated experiences of women or anybody else. So when they think about the site and the money that they need to make, sometimes that's through plantation weddings or other things, they default to telling a less complicated story, thinking that'll bring more people in. But I think that what something like Whitney Plantation has showed us is that there's a tourist audience that wants complicated stories. I mean, even if we think about the folks on the other end who are watching this, I think many are probably watching because they're interested in knowing more. They're lifelong learners. They want more nuanced and complicated conversations about things. So I really think that sometimes it's a hard sell to these sites, but it's what I try to share. It's that I could understand their concerns, anxieties, sometimes fears around change, but the world is changing around them. And it's important to be able to move with and respond to that, especially with a lot of our younger folks who are asking very complicated questions and want to have complicated engagements. You have to think about what your new tourist audience might want to see. I also think that sometimes these sites are reluctant to change because they don't know how to change. They don't feel like they're informed. They don't feel like they have the skill sets. And that might be true. Those are reasons, but they're not excuses. I think that, there are plenty of academics out there who do particular types of research who might want to help as a form of public history. And I think they have to ask for that supportive network so that they don't feel like they're alone in doing this type of work.
Wow. Someone says, thank you for this presentation. For an anthropologist early in their career, what do you think is the future of the discipline, and how do you recruit and retain students?
Oh, that's a good question. It sounds like somebody I know on the other end.
Could very well be.
It's a really great question. I think that, what I found even in the past 11 years or so that I've been at the University of Mississippi is that so many students have no idea what anthropology even is at this point. And it's taken connections to public connections to people like Zora Neale Hurston to be able to help us along. So I think that what anthropology really has to do is show that it's relevant, it has been for a long time, and that it could help people really think through what it means to have social change. Anthropologists, sociologists as well, to a certain extent, although their methods are very different, really try to, especially applied anthropologists, they do things like think about public health crises. What are the particular experiences that local communities have that might cause them to respond to or not respond to a public health crisis, and how federal governments might be able to help them? So anthropologists can really help us solve real world problems because they help us understand how communities operate and how they think. I just don't think that the field of anthropology has necessarily done the best job of making that known, making that accessible, that this is the type of work that we do. For example, my work has been to help people think about how to interpret slavery. That's a very real world problem that I'm trying to help people solve. I might have missed the second part of that question, if you don't mind repeating that for me.
Sure. She says, what do you think is the future of the discipline, and how do you recruit and retain BIPOC students?
Yeah, so I think, with BIPOC students, I think a lot of that recruitment is going to have to come around students understanding that anthropology is not just about studying other people, it's also about studying your people and yourself. And that's something that I didn't know and understand when I first came into anthropology. I didn't understand that anthropology could be as micro scale as me studying my family and its Creole culture, right? Me studying the experiences of enslaved Africans. I think that what we really have to do to connect to BIPOC students is get them to understand that this is really about understanding their experiences as well. It doesn't have to be. You can go to Brazil or Colombia and study if that's what you choose to do. But it could also be about helping to solve local problems. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to understand that anthropology is global, but also be able to market it as a local study or helping to understand local experiences. And that's the work that I've been trying to do. But anthropology really needs to work on that. Wow. It's a good question.
Do you recommend doing a museum first to start enriching a history tour? would the museum be first before any other types of tours? Probably. I think that's what the
Yeah, that's it's certainly going to depend on the museums. Some historic sites do that kind of interpretive work with exhibits. Whitney Plantation is one of those. When you first walk in, there's an exhibit before you get the actual tour. I would, that's a good question. I would think, even if I take the state of Mississippi, for example, I would think that maybe the Civil Rights Museum there would be a good starting point before you start to look at the historic sites. And what they do there is strategically try to point you to some of those historic sites. So when you look at the exhibit, they might say, okay, this is a particular house related to a certain historical figure, and this is where this house is located, so that you could strategically go to that historic site. So I think that what you would probably want to do is find a museum that could be kind of what I would consider the point museum for you before you went to other places. And that might take a little upfront work depending on where you are.
Okay. She says it's a statement. However, could you teach the history of the antebellum South without it being ugly? Which isn't really a question, it's just the truth.
No, you can't. You can't. It's all history is difficult. What we do is because history no longer exists, we create it and reimagine it. And sometimes we do that in sanitized ways to make it more palatable. Sometimes it's a power issue. It's about being able to control particular groups of people using history. We see that in politics all the time. But no, and I understand that it was a comment. I certainly agree with it if the participant is saying that you can't do it without the ugly.
Gotcha. So here's our final question. Is there a consortium among historic sites to collaborate on how to present the history of enslaved people?
I'm not quite sure about a consortium of historic sites. There could be. It doesn't mean that there's not one, but I know that there is a consortium of academics thinking about these things. One of them is Tourism Reset. And I can't remember what the RESET acronym stands for, and I don't want to mess it up. But if you Google it, you'll see that. And some of that work involves a few geographers from the University of Tennessee's Knoxville campus and some other folks with whom they work. They did quite a bit of research at plantation sites in Virginia, Louisiana, and South Carolina to think through these things. So they kind of compare what's going on at these sites to help us understand that. So that's one consortium of sorts. There are also the universities studying slavery. So some university associated tours might be under that umbrella as well. That's some of the work we're doing with Faulkner's Roanoke at the University of Mississippi. The University of Mississippi owns William Faulkner's house, but it was one of these in-town estates where enslaved people were. So we're thinking through issues like that as well. The National Council on Public History might have something if you Google their site, but there's nothing more concrete that I could think of at this time.
Thank you. Well, we want to, first of all, thank you so much for a powerful, engaging, and educational presentation. I'm walking away, and I'm sure all of the viewers, with lots of new information. And if you want more, by all means, get a copy by Dr. Jody Skipper. This book is awesome. So thank you again for letting us have your presence tonight as our special guest author.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Mr. Gauthier, for the very thoughtful questions. And thanks so much to the audience for taking the time to watch.